They told him, "Customers like you don't belong here." The moment he stepped through the door, an old faded coat, scuffed shoes, jeans worn thin with time. Thomas Green looked like just another retiree living off Social Security who had accidentally wandered into a high-end restaurant in the middle of the city. No one knew he was the very man who founded this famous restaurant chain, Green & Oak, with dozens of locations across the states. And no one had a clue that today he was here to investigate his own staff. Just a week earlier, the financial report from this branch looked perfectly normal. Steady customer traffic, even higher than last year. Yet, the revenue had plummeted. There were no issues with ingredients, no glitches in the payment system, and no bad reviews on platforms like Yelp or Google Review. Everything seemed normal. But that normal was exactly what made Thomas suspicious. He'd been in this industry for over 30 years. From a dishwasher and waiter to the owner of a fine dining empire, Thomas knew one thing for certain. When every metric looks fine but the money isn't adding up, there's an invisible problem lurking somewhere. And usually, it's not the food. It's the people. Thomas didn't want to call in auditors. He didn't want to install more security cameras or demand internal reports either. Those things might make the staff perform better for a while, but they'd never show him the truth. So he went back to the old way, disguise himself, and dine like a regular customer. Thomas called it the art of disappearing, a skill he'd mastered back when he was still a server, disappearing from status, from power, from identity. So no one would treat him like the boss, but like someone invisible, just as so many ordinary guests are treated every single day. He walked into the Green & Oak branch in Charlotte at noon, the busiest hour of the day. The gentle clinking of glasses, soft conversations, and classical music drifting from the ceiling speakers filled the air. The space was elegant, warm golden lighting, polished dark wood tables, crisp white linens ironed to perfection, just like in a five-star hotel. Everything matched the exact standards Thomas had set more than a decade ago. Everything, except for one thing, the look in people's eyes. The moment he stepped in, the hostess frowned for a split second before forcing a stiff smile. She glanced him up and down, as if trying to figure out whether he was lost or looking for a job. Her hand veered awkwardly over the tablet on the counter, unsure of what to do next. "Hello, are you dining alone, sir?" she asked hesitantly. Thomas nodded, saying nothing. He wanted everything to unfold as naturally as possible. "I'm sorry. We're quite busy right now. Do you have a reservation?" "No." "Yes, so could you please wait in the lounge area in the back while we prepare a table for you?" No polite invitation, no genuine smile. The hostess turned away almost immediately. Thomas knew that kind of treatment. It was the way staff without respect for their craft behaved toward people they thought weren't worth much. He sat down on a brown leather sofa near the window, running his hand gently along the armrest. Every detail was exactly as he remembered. The design, the texture, the placement, just as he had personally planned for every location. But the spirit was gone. Thomas wasn't angry. He was just quiet. The way a restaurant treats an unremarkable guest is the way it truly treats everyone. And he knew he'd be staying far longer than just one lunch today. Thomas sat there in silence, like a shadow in the elegant space he himself had once envisioned from the very first sketch. The server still hadn't come. 3 minutes, then 5, then 8. No water, no greeting, not even a glance. Thomas didn't look at anyone, but he could feel their eyes on him. The quick glances, the subtle nods, the hushed whispers that weren't quite quiet enough to escape his ears. A male waiter walked past the lounge area, giving him a quick head-to-toe look. Then he turned back toward the counter, leaned in and muttered to a coworker, just loud enough for Thomas to hear. "Probably lost. Doesn't look like the kind who can afford this place." The coworker, a young woman in a neat uniform, chuckled softly while polishing a glass, careful not to let the manager notice. But the disdain in her eyes wasn't something she could hide. And right after that, an unspoken game began, a silent round of passing the buck. A female server was called over to Thomas's table. She glanced his way, then turned around and walked off. Another waiter took half a step toward him, then stopped, pretending to check an order at a nearby table. Everyone saw him, but no one wanted to serve him. Thomas sat up straight, his expression calm, as if simply waiting for a menu. But inside, he already understood part of the mystery behind why this branch was packed with customers yet losing money. It was because they'd forgotten the most fundamental truth in the service industry. You never know who someone really is, and you never have the right to judge a guest by what they wear. At last, an older staff member, probably the one who got assigned all the unwanted tasks, was pushed forward to handle the situation. "Good afternoon, sir," he said, trying to sound professional, though his tone was stiff and rehearsed, like reading from a required script. "Sorry for the wait. Please follow me. I'll take you to your table." No explanation, no hint of apology. Just a quiet walk toward the far end of the restaurant, the spot hidden from view near the restroom doors, the kind of corner table usually reserved for solo diners or guests deemed less important. When he sat down, the waiter placed the menu on the table, as if he were dropping off a stack of paperwork. "What would you like to drink?" "Just water," Thomas replied softly. The waiter nodded and hurried away, almost as if afraid of being pulled into conversation. For several minutes afterward, no one approached. No wine suggestions. No mention of the weekly specials. No interest in the mood or experience of the lone stranger who'd just walked in. He didn't get angry. He didn't feel bitter. He simply observed. He noted every tiny detail, everything an ordinary customer would go through. In the early days during staff training sessions, he used to tell his employees, "There's no such thing as a small customer, only a poor server." But it seemed no one remembered that anymore. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small pen. On the corner of the menu, he scribbled a few short notes in tiny handwriting. 10 minutes, no greeting, staff whispering, judgmental, reluctant attitude, no menu introduction, no appetizer offer, seated in a hidden spot, not prioritized. Each line was brief and clinical, like a report. But behind those words was a quiet disappointment he wasn't yet ready to name. Because Thomas knew, the most dangerous thing in this business isn't one big mistake. It's the hundreds of small ones, repeated day after day, until they harden into culture. A silent culture of discrimination. He looked up, eyes drifting toward the center of the restaurant. There, the other staff were still laughing and chatting cheerfully, all smiles with the other tables, the ones filled with guests in dress shirts, nice dresses, leather shoes, designer bags. No one glanced toward the corner table. No one noticed him anymore. And then he saw what he needed to see. In the middle of all that luxury, something was missing. Not money, not customers, but heart. Thomas stayed still, said nothing, just quietly, kept observing. He had just finished writing his final note when he heard soft footsteps approaching. Not hurried, not forced, not the sharp click of heels that came from mechanical routine. The steps were calm, deliberate, human. A young woman stopped beside his table holding a tray with a glass of water. Her eyes didn't avoid his. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm so sorry for keeping you waiting," she said gently, her voice clear, an apology that felt real, not rehearsed. Thomas looked up and met her warm brown eyes. There was no curiosity, no caution. She looked at him the way someone looks at a person who truly deserves to be welcomed, not a misplaced guest. "My name's Emily," she added, setting the glass of water gently in front of him. "Today's my 14th day working here. I'm still learning, but I'll do my best to take good care of you." Thomas simply nodded, saying nothing. He watched the way she handled the tray, the careful motion as she poured water from the small glass carafe. Not too slow, not too fast, and with none of the subtle irritation the others had shown. Emily didn't leave right after pouring, the way most servers would. She stayed for a moment, her smile calm and steady, then asked, "Would you like to see our vegetarian menu, sir? We've added a few new dishes this week. I can get them from the kitchen if you'd like." That simple question made Thomas pause for a second, not because he was vegetarian, but because she had asked it as if he were the very first guest to walk in today. No assumptions, no rushing to label or judge, just genuine, thoughtful attention. "You think I should go vegetarian?" Thomas asked, half joking. "No, but you seem like someone who cares about your health," Emily replied with a smile. "And actually, I'm vegetarian myself, so I tend to notice who might enjoy those dishes." Thomas smiled, for the first time that day, not because of the joke, but because of how comfortably honest she was. There was no flattery, no pretense, just a young woman doing her job with sincerity. Emily handed him a small menu, waiting patiently as he flipped through a few pages. She didn't rush him, didn't disappear right after offering. She was present, not just performing a role, but truly serving. "When you're ready, just give me a little wave, and I'll come right back," she said finally, before stepping away. Thomas watched her go, her hair neatly tied back, her flat shoes slightly worn, Unlike the perfectly made-up staff bustling around the main floor, Emily's simplicity stood out. Yet every gesture she made was filled with quiet attention to detail. A few minutes later, she returned, this time carrying a different glass and setting it gently on the table. "I noticed you coughed a bit earlier," she said softly. "This is honey ginger tea. If you don't like it, I can bring you something else." Thomas looked at the glass, then at her. "You're very observant." "My mom taught me that serving isn't just about bringing food," Emily said with a small smile. "It's about making someone feel seen." That sentence kept Thomas silent for a long moment. He had heard employees talk about sales, KPIs, table turnover, and tips more times than he could count. But when was the last time he'd heard someone talk about making guests feel seen? He nodded slowly, a quiet warmth softening his gaze. Emily had no idea who he was, no clue that the man sitting before her owned the very restaurant chain she worked for. She just saw someone being treated poorly and chose to act the way everyone in this business should have. In that moment, Thomas felt something ease inside him, a quiet, lingering doubt that had been gnawing at him all afternoon. Maybe the system hadn't lost its soul completely. Maybe it had only fallen asleep. And someone like Emily, with her quiet, genuine kindness, had just unknowingly helped awaken it. He bowed his head slightly, not as thanks for the drink, but for something far more meaningful, for reminding him what it felt like to be served as a person, just that, not a walking wallet. As the restaurant slowly emptied and the lights softened with the rhythm of late afternoon, Thomas left his table but didn't go far. He stepped outside and sat on the long oak bench facing the main entrance. A light breeze swept across the stone-paved street. He took out his notebook, flipped through the notes from his meal, and stopped at one name. The girl who had served him that day. Emily. A few minutes later, the restaurant door swung open. Quick, steady footsteps echoed down the steps. Thomas looked up and saw Emily walking out, a light jacket over her shoulders, a small backpack on her back. She stopped when she noticed him, looking a bit surprised. "You're still here?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Yeah, nice breeze," Thomas replied. "I have this habit of sitting a while after meals, helps with digestion." Emily laughed softly, then instead of walking off, turned back and sat beside him. "Me too, but for me, it's more about cooling down after a shift. My head's still spinning from today." Thomas glanced over. "Because of difficult customers?" "Not exactly," Emily shrugged. "More because of how some people treated you earlier. I'm not used to that." Thomas stayed quiet, giving her space to continue. "My mom used to work at a roadside motel," Emily said, her eyes drifting off toward the fading light. "Nothing fancy, just a stopover for truck drivers or people who couldn't afford downtown hotels." "Was it tough?" Thomas asked. "Very," she said with a soft laugh. "She cleaned every room from top to bottom. The guests came in all kinds, but she never complained. She always said, service isn't a lowly job, it's just paid politeness." Thomas nodded, as if committing the words to memory. "She also told me, if you choose to work in this business, don't let anyone define your dignity by what you do, but by how you do it." Her fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her backpack. "I remember every word. When I was little, I used to sit in the laundry room reading books while the dryer spun non-stop. Watching my mom bend down to change sheets, I promised myself that one day I'd work somewhere elegant, but not so people would call me classy. I just wanted to prove that someone like my mom deserves to belong in a place like that." Thomas looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. It was no longer the gaze of a hidden customer, but of a man who had once been young, once had ideals, once built everything with his own two hands. "So this is your first step?" he asked. "Yes," Emily said with quiet certainty. "I've always wanted to work in a fine dining restaurant. Even if it's just in the lowest position, I want to learn from the inside. I want to see how the system really works. I want to know if the quality everyone talks about includes how we treat people." Thomas tilted his head slightly. "And what did you see today?" Emily hesitated for a moment. "I saw that some people here don't understand the value of service. They can't tell the difference between genuine courtesy and fake politeness. They think good service means being nice to people who look rich. Hiss of it, they don't realize that guests like you are guests too." He smiled faintly. "And you think you can change that?" "Not right away," Emily said. "But I believe it's possible. If I can work my way up to a position where my voice matters, I want to create a place where everyone is respected, staff and guests alike. I don't want to be a boss just to manage people." I want to be a leader who shapes the culture of where I work. Thomas sat quietly for a moment, eyes fixed on the street ahead. Something in his chest tightened. How long had it been since he'd heard the word influence used in this industry without being followed by profit? He had started his business with one dream: to build a place people came to not just for the food, but for the feeling of being welcomed. Yet over time, through rounds of funding and endless meetings about metrics, he had somehow lost sight of that. And now, a woman barely in her 20s, sitting on the oak bench outside the very restaurant he'd built, had just reminded him of it. "Emily," he said, his voice lower than before. "Thank you." "For what?" she asked, surprised. "For reminding me that there are still people who believe in kindness." Emily smiled softly. "I think a lot of people still believe in it. They just don't think it matters in the workplace." Thomas met her gaze. "And I think it's the very thing that decides whether a place deserves to exist at all." Neither of them said another word. Evening settled in. Streetlights flickered on. Emily stood up, gave him a small nod, and walked away. Thomas stayed seated, his hand resting on his notebook, but this time, he didn't write a thing. He just sat there, letting the story live in his mind exactly as it was, untouched, unedited. A week later, Thomas returned. Same worn-out coat, same faded jeans, scuffed shoes, a knit cap pulled low over his salt and pepper hair. He walked from a parking lot 2 blocks away, keeping to the quieter side of the street, as if trying to erase himself from the city's map on that late winter afternoon. The restaurant door swung open, the familiar chime above it ringing softly. Everything he expected appeared exactly the same. The hostess from that day was still there. Same face, same quick glance, scanning him head to toe in 3 seconds, followed by that same awkward, forced smile. Thomas didn't even need to look closely to know what was running through her mind. "I'm sorry, sir, do you have a reservation?" Her voice came out mechanical, stripped of any warmth, unchanged since the last visit. "No," Thomas replied curtly. "All right, we're quite busy at the moment. You may have to wait a bit." No offer of water, no name taken for the wait list, no clear instructions. He was left standing there like a mild inconvenience in the middle of the walkway. The same employees he remembered were still there. The same male waiter who had whispered about him last time now stood near the bar, shot him a glance, then looked away. A female server passed by carrying a tray, pretending not to see him, even though the narrow hallway barely allowed for one person to pass. A few minutes later, the hostess called over another employee, a young woman who looked like she was still in training. "Can you take him to a table in the back?" "The back where?" the girl asked quietly, a bit unsure. "Next to the storage door, the 2-seater. The same table as before, the table for unimportant people." Thomas followed the young server without a word. She hurried ahead, dropped the menu onto the table, and walked off immediately. No question about what he'd like to drink, no friendly welcome, no mention of the weekly specials, not even a smile. He sat down and flipped through a few pages of the menu, not to read, but to see if anyone would notice he might need something. 10 minutes passed, no one came back. But then, like a quiet pause in a chaotic melody, Emily appeared. She stepped out from the kitchen, carrying a tray of water. Her eyes swept across the room and stopped when she saw Thomas sitting alone at the corner table. She froze for a brief moment, then smiled. "You look familiar," she said as she walked over. "Didn't you order the mushroom soup last time? I remember guests who share my taste." Thomas looked up, his expression softening. "You've got a good memory." "I tend to remember kind people," Emily replied without hesitation. "I was the one who served you that day." She poured his water carefully, unhurried, then pulled a folded special menu from the pocket of her apron. "We've got a new dish, wild mushroom risotto. If you're still a mushroom fan, it's definitely worth a try. But I also wanted to ask if you have any allergies. Cheese? Garlic? Nuts?" Thomas studied her for a few seconds before replying. "No, I can eat anything." "All right then," she said with a nod. "I'll have the kitchen make one for you, but I'll tell them to go a little lighter on the salt, just in case you prefer milder flavors." Thomas smiled faintly. "You always pay that much attention to detail?" "Yes," Emily said. "My mom taught me that everyone deserves a meal that suits their needs, even if they never say it out loud." When she turned to leave, her movements were as graceful as when she'd arrived. No unnecessary words, no forced gestures. Everything she did was measured, enough, but never excessive. Thomas watched her go, his gaze no longer that of a man inspecting his staff, but of someone witnessing one of the few rare things still left in the service world: kindness that doesn't ask to be noticed. When the dish arrived, Emily brought it herself. "I've placed lemon water and a bit of salt on the side, in case you'd like to adjust the flavor, and if you'd prefer something else, I'll be right here." Thomas nodded. He wasn't very hungry, but he felt deeply grateful for the care. Throughout the entire meal, not a single other staff member checked on him. No one asked if everything was all right. No one glanced his way to see if he needed anything. They only hovered around the tables with well-dressed guests, shiny watches, designer handbags, and expensive smiles. Thomas jotted a few notes in his small notebook, but this time he wrote only one line. "The problem isn't in the food, it's in the hearts of the people serving it." A week later, on a bright, sunlit afternoon, a sleek black sedan pulled up in front of the restaurant's entrance. The car door opened, and the man who stepped out no longer wore a worn-out coat or a knit cap. Thomas Green that day was dressed in a perfectly tailored light gray suit, polished leather shoes, and a neatly knotted silk tie. His silver hair was combed back, and on his wrist was a rare, understated Patek watch. Impossible to mistake. He didn't need to say a word. He simply walked straight toward the door. Immediately, one of the staff members hurried to open it for him, bowing slightly. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome. Do you have a reservation?" Thomas smiled and gave a gentle nod. "No, just passing by." The hostess instantly recognized the designer suit. Her face lit up with a bright, practiced smile. "We're honored to have you. Please give me a moment. I'll arrange our best table for you." Less than a minute later, a waiter appeared with a black leather-bound menu, the special one reserved for VIP guests. Another staff member brought a glass of ice water and asked if he'd like a starter wine. Two more approached to offer help with his coat and to pull out his chair. The whole atmosphere shifted into first-class mode. Thomas sat by the window, one of the finest seats in the restaurant, and quietly observed. In every polite gesture and flawless smile, he could read the pattern. No one recognized him as the same man they had once ignored. No one questioned anything. They simply saw an elegantly dressed gentleman and immediately switched to their perfect service script. Except for one person whose gaze was different. "Good afternoon, sir," Emily said, her smile as gentle as ever. "It's really nice to see you again." Thomas looked at her, warmth flickering in his eyes. "Not offering me the vegetarian menu this time?" Emily raised an eyebrow and tilted her head slightly. "I actually have it ready," she said. "But I figured today you might want to try the chef's special." "You guessed right." She placed the menu down and added, "The kitchen's featuring a new Wagyu steak today. But if you'd prefer something lighter, I can recommend a few options that might suit you better. Either way, as always, if you have any allergies, please let me know." Thomas nodded. The way she stood, upright, steady, her gaze direct and calm, not the slightest hint of nervousness or flattery because of his suit. No exaggeration, no act, just Emily, exactly as she'd been every other time he'd met her. The meal was flawless. The main course beautifully plated, the wine poured at the perfect temperature, the service polished to perfection, everything by the book of fine dining. But to Thomas, all those perfect details only made the contrast with the previous visits more striking. When he finished his dessert, he set his napkin down and motioned for the floor manager to come over. "I'd like to see the entire staff," he said. The manager hesitated. "Is something wrong, sir? Was anything not to your satisfaction?" "No," Thomas replied calmly. "Everything was excellent, and that's exactly why I'd like to speak with everyone, right now." The manager nodded, visibly unsettled, and quickly pulled out his phone to message the active shift groups. Within minutes, the entire staff, servers, kitchen crew, and management gathered in the lounge area at the back of the restaurant. The room buzzed with nervous whispers. Some straightened their uniforms, others wiped their hands on their aprons. A few exchanged uneasy glances. "Go back." Thomas stood in the center of the room, holding nothing. No notes, no phone, no assistant at his side. "My name is Thomas Green," he began, his voice steady but firm, carrying just enough weight to fill the room. "I'm the founder of Green & Oak. And this is the third time I've visited this restaurant in the past 3 weeks." Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Eyes widened. A few gasps caught mid-breath. The hostess took a step back, her face drained of color. The waiter who'd mocked him on that first visit turned away, staring at the floor. No one dared to move. No one even dared to breathe. "The first 2 times," Thomas continued, "I didn't wear a suit. I didn't arrive in a luxury car, and I wasn't wearing an expensive watch. I walked into this restaurant like any ordinary person, someone who could have been anyone. His eyes swept slowly across the room, pausing on each face just long enough for the weight of his words to sink in. And in those moments, I saw the true face of this restaurant's service culture. The silence deepened. No one dared to shift or speak. Emily stood near the doorway, not avoiding his gaze, but calm, composed, the only person in the room who didn't look shocked, because she didn't need to be. To her, he was the same guest he had been that first day, and her way of serving had never depended on the price of someone's clothes. Thomas gave her a small nod of acknowledgement before turning back to the group. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't scold, he simply stood there, steady, composed, and spoke not as a boss, but as someone who had seen enough of the world to know the difference between standards and soul. I started Green and Oak from a tiny place with 10 tables, Thomas said. Back then, I didn't have much capital, no marketing strategy, no consultants. What I did have was a very simple belief. People don't come to a restaurant just to eat. They come to feel welcomed. He paused for a moment, his gaze softening. Today I'm standing here not because the food is bad or because the numbers have dropped. I'm here because the philosophy, that original belief, no longer lives in this place. The air in the room grew heavy, dense, as if even breathing carried guilt. I'm not angry, Thomas continued, his voice quieter now. I'm disappointed. Because maybe somewhere along the way as this company grew, I allowed the spreadsheets and reports to blind us to what really matters. The heart of a restaurant isn't in the kitchen, it's in how we treat people. He looked around once more, his eyes no longer sharp but filled with sincere sorrow. But I also saw something else. I saw one employee who's only been here 2 weeks, still holding on to the very essence of this profession. He turned toward Emily. You didn't know who I was, but you treated me as someone worthy of being served. Not because I looked rich or poor, but because I was a person who deserved to be heard. Emily looked momentarily stunned, but she stayed composed. She didn't speak. The entire room watched Thomas in silence. That's why, he continued, starting tomorrow, I'll be restructuring the entire service system in this branch, from how we approach customers, to how we train, to the very attitude behind it. And the person I trust to lead that change is you, Emily. A low murmur rippled through the room. Some faces froze in disbelief, others flickered with envy. But Thomas didn't pay it any mind. Emily will take on the role of assistant manager, he said firmly. She won't be doing it alone. I'll send people to support her. But the direction, the spirit, the way forward will begin with her heart. Thomas gave her a small nod, then turned and walked out of the room, leaving a stunned, wordless silence behind him. A year later, the sign in front of the restaurant changed. Beneath the name Green and Oak was a new line, managed by Emily Parker. Emily was only 26, the youngest manager in the entire chain, but no one questioned it anymore. Under her leadership, the restaurant not only recovered its revenue, but went on to win the Customer Experience Excellence Award from the Independent Service Association. What stood out most in the judge's report wasn't the menu nor the decor, but one particular line: consistent kindness in every customer interaction. Emily didn't keep that success to herself. She launched an internal training program across all Green and Oak branches, titled Serving with Heart. The very first session was held at the same location that, a year earlier, had nearly become the downfall of the entire brand. In that small training room, Emily didn't talk about her mother. She didn't mention Thomas. She didn't even bring up the visits that changed everything. She simply said one thing: we don't serve to make money. We serve to earn trust, and trust doesn't wear a suit. The room fell silent. But from that day on, no one ever saw their job as just temporary again. That evening, a man stood quietly on the sidewalk across the street, hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching through the glass window. He didn't go inside. He didn't want to be noticed. Thomas Green smiled. Not because profits had risen, not because the brand's reputation had been restored, but because he saw something far more important. Faith in people, and in the craft he had once chosen, had finally returned. No one mentioned that he was the one who set the change in motion. And he didn't need them to. Because what he needed to see was already there. In the eyes of the staff greeting guests with sincerity. In the way a young woman was now passing on what she believed was right. In the air of a place where kindness had become culture. Thomas turned away, walking slowly down the street, For the first time in many years, he felt light, not because a burden had been lifted, but because what was right had finally found a place to belong. Some lessons aren't found in textbooks, nor taught by people standing at a podium. They're revealed in how we treat those who seem unimportant. In a world obsessed with appearances and status, can you still tell the difference between a customer and a moment where your heart is being tested? Have you ever walked into a place and felt judged simply because you didn't fit the mold? What do you think matters most in the service industry? Skill, speed, or kindness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with something inside you, don't forget to follow the channel so you won't miss the next one. Thank you for taking the time to listen. See you again on the next emotional journey.